Good morning. How often have you seen somebody and said, "Oh, he's just like his father"? Maybe people have said that about you. My mum said it about me once, and she didn't mean it as a compliment. Well, can we say that about Jesus? Is he just like his father? And if so, who do we mean when we talk about Jesus' father? Several times in the Gospels, people call Jesus the son of David. David was his ancestral father. So can we see David in Jesus? Is he just like his father? Well, one way to find out is to see who was calling him the son of David and trying to work out what they saw in him that made them say that. In our reading that Stephen read, the person saying it was a Canaanite woman with a demon-possessed daughter. I wonder what made her give Jesus that name. She wasn't an Israelite, she was a Gentile, living in an area not fully part of Israel. And she knew who Jesus was, the son of David, not just the descendant of David, not just the descendant of Israel's most famous king, but the anointed one, the Messiah. So she decided to take her daughter to him for healing. The poor girl was suffering from an evil spirit, but her mother knew that Jesus could drive out the evil and rescue her. That's why they both came to him. And this woman impressed Jesus with her faith. First of all, the disciples tried to turn her away, but she didn't give up. And then, horror of horrors, Jesus said no. I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. It's not right to give the children's bread to dogs. Charming. But she didn't even give up then. She talked to Jesus and she persuaded him to heal her daughter. But even the dogs under the table eat the scraps that the children drop. And it was only then, because of her perseverance and her faith to persevere, that Jesus healed the girl right there. How often do we feel that our prayers are like that? God doesn't always answer prayers straight away. He wants us to ask, and he wants us to persevere in prayer for the things that we need. Ideally, that persevering in prayer will help us to refine and evolve our prayers, and they gradually come more into line with God's will. That process of asking and reflecting and asking again makes us listen to God, trying to hear what he wants for us. Through that process, we grow and we make ourselves available to God to do something in our lives that will glorify him. And maybe that will be even beyond satisfying our immediate needs, just like he did for that Canaanite woman. Because Jesus didn't say yes straight away, they had this interesting conversation. And it's the conversation which, when we think it through, ends up telling us a lot about Jesus. She wanted him to cast out evil from her daughter, but the way Matthew's written down the events, we see Jesus showing that he came to cast out all evil, not just individual spirits. He also gives a coded message that he will bring not only this Gentile Canaanite woman and her daughter into his kingdom, but that the whole world will be gathered into him. So how do we work that one out? Well, there's a big clue in the place where she lived, Tyre and Sidon, just over the border from Galilee. When God gave the Israelites the promised land, the Bible lists 7 pagan tribes that were already living in the region: the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and the Amalekites. And they're collectively known as the Canaanites. And when Joshua led the Israelites into the land, they had to move those people on in order to take over the land and claim it for God. Tyre and Sidon had originally been part of the land promised to Abraham. But when the Israelites got there, they didn't manage to conquer the Tyre and Sidon, so those two towns were never actually incorporated into the kingdom of Israel. They got left out of the promised land. But if these places weren't part of Israel, why did Jesus go there to teach, especially as he says explicitly that he's come primarily for the Jews? But Tyre and Sidon have this strange status of being promised but not claimed. So Jesus sought them out and gave them a second chance to come in. That's why he visited them in Matthew 15. He was giving them an early opportunity to not be left out again, to be restored to their rightful place as part of his kingdom. He was putting right something that Israel messed up right at the start, restoring his people and gathering in those who were missing, but not through a show of force, but through his love and the compassion expressed in his healing and his personal encounters. Like David the shepherd boy, he was searching for lost sheep. And like David the shepherd king, he was establishing his rule over his rightful kingdom. It seems that it worked too. People can come to Jesus from anywhere. Back in the Old Testament, the people of Tyre and Sidon used to worship a goddess called Asherah, and they were not very good neighbours to Israel. They were so bad that both Jeremiah and Ezekiel pronounced God's judgment on them for their idolatry and for being enemies of Israel. But maybe things can change. In Matthew 11, Jesus was in despair over the lack of faith that he sees in his own people, the Jews. He's done miracles in lots of towns, but people haven't believed in him or changed their ways. He says that if those miracles had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago with sackcloth and ashes, much like the equally pagan town of Nineveh that got Jonah so angry. He even says that on the day of judgment, it will be even more bearable for Tyre and Sidon than for his own people that haven't listened. That's a harsh warning against complacency. And it's quite an extreme thing to say because of those judgments from Jeremiah and Ezekiel. But all that Jesus wants is for people to change their ways and turn to him. But the challenge is that even if a place as bad as that can have a change of heart when they hear about Jesus, then surely God's own people ought to be showing much more faith. And it offers hope, the hope that even a place as bad as that can have a change of heart. And it's that principle that underpins the work of the church. Anyone can come to Jesus and anyone can change. We don't have to be good enough to come to him. We just have to come. We see how the presence of Jesus changes hearts and changes lives when Jesus goes to Tyre and Sidon in Matthew 15. This woman kneels at Jesus' feet, and Jesus commends her life-changing faith. She knows that even the scraps and crumbs that fall from Jesus, that fall from the Israelites' table, are worth having, and she'll settle for that for the healing of her daughter. Jesus came to rescue his children, the Jews, from the oppression of evil. And here he's let a scrap of that rescue fall from their table to this Canaanite daughter, who's under the table like the family dog. This image of scraps comes up again in the very next passage. After saving this girl from her evil spirit, Jesus goes back to Galilee, and a great crowd bring disabled and ill people to him for healing. Eventually, it's mealtime, and Jesus wants to feed them too. But all they have is 7 loaves and a few fish. But Jesus gives thanks and breaks the bread and gives it to the disciples and gives it to everyone. And everybody has plenty to eat. Afterwards, the disciples collect 7 basketfuls of scraps and leftovers. This is not a coincidence. We've just come from Tyre and Sidon, where a Canaanite woman was talking about getting scraps from the children's table. to this, a miracle done with 7 loaves and 7 baskets of scraps gathered in. These 2 events are together for a reason, and it gives us a massive clue. Those 7 loaves represent the 7 original nations now being used by Jesus to bless the crowd, just as God uses his children to bless the world. And the 7 baskets of leftovers show that Jesus wants to gather even those 7 rejected nations into his kingdom. But this time, instead of driving out the indigenous tribes with their pagan gods, he's driving out evil. And it won't stop at single evil spirits from individuals. Ultimately, he's getting rid of evil itself in his victory on the cross. The Jews wanted their Messiah to liberate them from the Romans, and we need him to liberate the Ukraine from Russia today. But Jesus shows us a bigger picture. It's not those evil oppressors like Russia or the Romans who are the enemy. It's evil itself which drives it all. And only Jesus can liberate the world from that. It's not until that defeat is complete that war and oppression and illness and disability and hunger will finally be driven from out of the world. But we have a taster in the miracles that Jesus performed. And that's exactly what he will do. He drove out that Canaanite girl's evil spirit to give us an inkling of his plan to get rid of evil. And he fed the hungry people in Galilee to show that he can drive out hunger too. He healed thousands of people that day and demonstrated that his rule will drive out all suffering. Those miracles here in the physical world lay the foundation for God's much bigger plan, which is to put an end to all evil, whether that's illness, hunger, spiritual oppression. In his ultimate kingdom, everything will be redeemed and restored. Not just Israel, not just a Canaanite girl, not even just the Gentile nations that Israel displaced, but the whole world and all creation, including, of course, us. We say in the communion service that we are not worthy to gather up the crumbs under God's table. But just as we see here, his nature is always to have mercy, and he welcomes us in and restores us, just as he did when he was on earth. So perhaps it was this that these suffering people recognized in Jesus when they called him the Son of David. They recognized their need for restoration. And deep down, they recognized that the Messiah is all about restoration, putting things right, redeeming what was lost. The reign of King David restored Israel spiritually after the erratic reign by Saul. Saul had lost God's favor, whereas God promised never to abandon David. He gave the kingdom a strong spiritual lead. David restored peace in the country after a long period of attacks by various enemies. And David restored the kingdom into a unified whole after it was cut in two. He brought Israel and Judah together as one kingdom. As David's son, Jesus brings the same kinds of restoration. He brings spiritual restoration because he rules with justice and righteousness, and he restores us, his people. He brings peace because he defeated the ultimate enemy, evil, on the cross. And he restores wholeness and unity. Unity between us and God, unity with each other, and the unity of the whole world brought together under one rightful king. The other thing those people crying out to Jesus, Son of David, may have had in mind is the eternalness of Jesus. God's promise to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 is that David's anointed son would be a king forever on an everlasting throne. And that means, by definition, he defied death. Death and decay go together, and you can't have eternal life without health. So if Jesus is the eternal King that will rule forever, then it follows that he can bring health. Peter explains this in his sermon on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Verse 31 says, "Seeing what was to come, David spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, that he was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it." For Peter, Jesus' resurrection proves that he is the one David was talking about, the Messiah. And it proves that those suffering people like the Canaanite woman were right to call out to Jesus for healing. I want to end with some words that King David said to a priest escaping from the wrath of Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 22. Saul had all the prophets of Nob killed. One man, Abiathar, escaped, and he ran to David's camp in distress. David said, "Stay with me. Don't be afraid. The man who wants to kill you is trying to kill me too. You will be safe with me." And Jesus says the same to us. If we stick with him, we don't need to be afraid, because the evil that's causing us to suffer is the same evil that tried to kill Jesus. It didn't succeed. We're safe as long as we're with Jesus, the Son of David.